My name is Dr. Uju Anya, and I'm here to talk to you about understanding our students' identities, motivations, and investments when we teach English to speakers of other languages. So we have 4 questions for those of us who teach English learners. The first is, who am I? The second, who are our learners? The third, how do our learners' identities influence their motivations and investments? And finally, we'd like to ask ourselves, as those who teach English learners, how can we put our understanding of English learners' identities, motivations, and investments into practice in the classroom? We ask ourselves, who am I? Let me tell you who I am. I'm an applied linguist. I specialize in second language learning, and I'm most interested in sociocultural and sociolinguistic ideas of the co-construction and navigation of identities in language learning. Now, my personal backgrounds and my journeys in my own life inform my work. I am somebody's daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a friend, I'm a learner. Most importantly, I'm a teacher, I'm a scholar, I'm a wife, mother, citizen, community member, multilingual person, and I'm a participant in many different communities of practice. All of these different multiplicities and identities inform what I do in the classroom. And most importantly, I believe in change through communication. I believe in promoting individual and societal transformation through second language research and practice. So, asking yourself, who are you? As a teacher, we would like to think that when we enter the classroom, teachers do not leave behind our many selves, our ideas, and our experiences. So, ask yourself, what's your background? What are your experiences learning, speaking new and different languages? What are your beliefs about language teaching, about language learning, and about your students? What aspect of your multiple identities most strongly influences your work? All of these questions and the answers to them contribute to our understanding of who we are in the classroom, our identities and multiplicities in second language teaching and learning. Now, identity research in second language learning asks all these questions, and we do so to move beyond what has typically been the psycholinguistic models of input, output, or information processing, and this search for universals. Now, this is not to discount psycholinguistic models and psycholinguistic research in second language learning. This is only to say that in addition to understanding psychological processes, cognitive processes, we also need to understand the social world around our learners and the worlds that constitute our learners themselves. Language learners have history. They're socially situated. They're active agents and participants in multiple communities of practice, and they desire to participate in others, for example, the target language speaking communities. So, second language learning asks if and how these learners can fully participate in the communities that they choose. Before we can discuss identities in English language learning, we need to establish some basic understandings about what language and identity are. First of all, what is language? We understand language as oral, written, symbolic, and embodied speech. That's how we typically see language. But in addition to that, language is also a highly localized, social, meaning-making, signifying practice or action. It's not just the sign signifier system. Language, additionally, is where we struggle for meaning, where we struggle for truth and power. Language is where we construct ourselves, define ourselves, and define who others are. So when I talk about language as being a practice or social action, we see language as not what we use, but what we do. And when I talk about language as the locus of this fight for truth and power, think about common struggles that we're having now in defining who is who in popular culture and popular understanding. Like the word undocumented versus illegal, when we're talking about those who are in the United States without the right papers, right? If you call a human being an illegal, we talk about them in terms of the illegitimacy of their place or their very humanity. Now, when we call that same individual undocumented, we're just referring to their status, as in someone who doesn't have the correct documentation to be in this country. And language is more than just what we say. Language teaches us how to think. Language teaches us how to imagine our world and others, and by extension, how to treat others. So figuring out the right word or the word to use when defining populations is not just a linguistic struggle. It's also a struggle for the truth about those people and power and dominance in our treatment of them. So, what is identity? Identity is what we understand identity to be, a material or a sense of belonging to a group, our blood kinships, for example. Now, this is a very stable and fixed notion of identity. In addition to these stable aspects of identity, identity is also very relational. It's a sociocultural phenomenon. It emerges in discourse and interactions with one another, and it's not just this fixed or stable part of an individual. Take me, for instance. I have this identity as a professor, and in certain interactions and certain spaces, I have that identity and I can be regarded as such. But in a different space and in a different interaction, I have a totally different identity. Different language is used in that space to refer to me, and I also engage others using different language and in very different ways. So in this way, identity is not very fixed, and it's something that emerges in discourse and interaction. Another way of looking at identity as not being fixed is the difference between sex and gender. For example, I was born female. That is a biological reality. However, sociologically, somebody taught me how to act like a girl and how to be a woman. So, my sex is very stable and fixed. However, my gender, in many ways, is a performance, or how I do and how I am and how I interact with others in this world. Identity is also multiple, changing, and intersectional, meaning that we occupy multiple selves in multiple spaces, and we are positioned differently in different ways. Now, identity, very importantly, cannot be separated from language. Because we do language to understand our world, ourselves, and to give voice to our experiences. In the words of Chris Wheaton, as we acquire language, we learn to give voice, meaning, to our experience, and to understand it according to particular ways of thinking, particular discourses that predate our entry into language. These ways of thinking constitute our subjectivities. So if you imagine a child who, before this child even learns language, there's language all around this child, and the child's world is being defined using language. So the emotions that the child feels, they have words that the particular discourses and unique ways and understandings of the world around the child are helping the child to define. So how do we know we're even feeling emotions before we have the words to express those emotions and to describe what it is that they are? Or think about a word in the Chinese language, for example, that defines women of a certain age, past their 30s or so, who haven't yet been married. These women are in the popular language are called leftover women. Now, a child who is introduced into this language, who's learning language, is learning to not only understand this word as defining a woman of a certain age who has a certain social status, but is learning the social thinking and the discourses and the ideologies that surround this particular term that refer to the woman as leftover. Okay? This is what Whedon refers to as the particular discourses that predate our entry into language. And these discourses are what shapes our thoughts, because our thoughts shape our identities and our persons. So, second language learning is not just linguistic or cognitive processing and skills acquisition. It's more than that. It's imagining and then assuming new subjectivities or new identities through transformative, interactive socialization. And we as English teachers, we're there to accompany and facilitate and guide this process of transformation as our learners are experimenting with, assuming, and understanding their new selves in the English language. So second language learning is figuring out how to speak and do you in another language. So, there are three big ideas in second language learning that can be summarized as such. Language is action and social practice, and through this action and social practice, identities are produced. Secondly, identity is a construct with stable and unstable dimensions that's actively and cooperatively created, shaped, and negotiated in our thoughts, discourse, and interaction. And finally, second language learning is first imagining and then enacting new identities in transformative and interactive socialization. So let's talk about motivation. Let's talk about what drives our English learners in learning the language. Well, first of all, Gardner and Lambert introduced us to the idea of integrative and instrumental motivation. And Gardner went along and perfected these ideas. But the main point of instrumental motivation, for example, is the learner's desire to achieve functional goals using the second language. For example, they want to make more money or get a better job. This is defined as instrumental motivation to learn English. Gardner also talks to us about this idea of integrative motivation, which is the learner's desire to assimilate into a community of English speakers, for example. So it's a more touchy-feely construct of motivation in that the learner has this wish to be a part of an English-speaking community and is integratively motivated to assimilate and learn the language to better talk to the community members. Schumann also defines motivation as stimulus appraisal. Right? And this appraisal would be the learner judging and reacting to second language situations, that would be the stimuli, based on if it's new, if it's pleasant, if it seems possible to be able to engage in it, how it serves the learner's goals, their needs, or how it suits or harms their face. So this is stimulus appraisal, according to Schumann in his acculturation theory of language learning. And then Dornier finally talks to us about the second language, the L2 motivational self system. And this would be the learner's goal-oriented choices and strategies to fulfill what they imagine is this idealized future second language speaking self. So these constructs of motivation so far are very psychological. Right? They're centered on this ahistorical learner, right? This inward view of a learner, and it presumes a very problematic dichotomy of a learner as either being driven or motivated or not, and it doesn't really adequately account for the social world. And Norton then tells us that we need a more accurate, nuanced understanding of individual efforts and the choices that learners make to participate or not in second language learning. Because motivation so far in the psycholinguistic model has oversimplified the learner's self-concept and their identities. And they're very ambivalent sometimes and definitely inequitable relationships within the target language speaking community. So, Norton provides for us a sociocultural complement to psycholinguistic ideas on motivation and talks to us about this notion of investment. So, in addition to thinking about a learner's motivation to learn a language, we also have to think about their investment in what's happening around them as they're trying to learn a language. Their investment, for example, in the practices of our English language classroom. Investment asks us to think about a learner's desires, their choices, their efforts, the context around them, the resources that they have available to them. Investment also asks us to think about systematic patterns of control. For example, ideologies that govern whether they should be involved in language learning or how or not. And capital, right? Social capital, their networks and their ability to be involved, or their cultural capital and other resources. Investment also asks us to think about power and about how our learners feel when they're engaged in language learning interactions, about whether they are viewed as a valued communicator, as a valued contributor to interactions, and whether these interactions are equitable or whether they're in dominant situations or situations of being subordinated by others. Investment asks us to also think about the feasibility of fluency. Learners are thinking about it too, and their choices and their efforts in participating in the activities in your classroom are also determined by how possible they think that fluency will come as a result of this participation. And learners, when we think about investment, are also contemplating the possible gains and the returns that are available to them from engaging or as a result of engaging in identity transformation. So when you think about investment, it's a much more comprehensive construct, and it takes us not just from this view of the psycholinguistic processes within an individual learner, but also the sociocultural realities and factors that are involved in this language learning enterprise. So, why should we care about all of this? Why should this matter to us as English teachers, or specifically those who are going to be facilitating the personal transformation of language learners? My novice teachers always ask me, Dr. Anya, why does this matter? Why does all of this post-structuralist theory, what does it have to do with our classroom practice? Bonnie Norton tells us that, according to Mary Ashworth, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. And our post-structuralist understandings of identity and investment will definitely contribute to doing good work in the classroom, because we endeavor to do so, right? Good teachers try to know and understand the learners in our classrooms. And we know that the learners and we as teachers do not leave our multiple identities behind when we enter the classroom. On the contrary, identities greatly influence and inform our efforts and our choices to participate in the language learning community. So, being aware of identities in the classroom helps us to understand motivation. It helps us to understand our learners' investments, the social dynamics working in classroom communities, and most importantly, it helps us better support the process of personal transformation in which our learners are engaged. So, how do we understand some specific aspects of identity and how they play out in our individual classrooms? How do we understand race, for instance, or ethnicity, or gender, or sexuality, social class, nationality, or social status, all of which our learners bring with them as they enter our classroom? Why do these aspects of identity matter when we're teaching English to speakers of other languages? Well, we enter these questions by asking another, who are our learners? Let me talk to you about some learners that are examined, or their experiences are explored in some TESOL research. First of all, Bashir Ali talks to us about Maria. Maria is a high school student, a recent immigrant from Mexico, and she's living in the United States. And she's only been in the United States for about 2 years when Bashir Ali encounters her while doing this research. And Maria, she prefers speaking African American English to the standardized American English that's spoken as the language of school and academics. And Maria, she lies about her ethnic heritage in order to fit into her school. She goes to a majority black high school, right? And the people in that school that socially wield the most power are the African American students. Maria realizes this. She also realizes that the seat of the least amount of power lies with the new immigrants, the ESL students, right? So she lies about her ethnic heritage. She lies about the fact that she's an English learner in order to fit in with a dominant group in the school. And she wants to speak the language that's spoken by this dominant group. Now, because she refuses to speak bookish kind of English, or the standardized American English is taught in her ESL class, she's labeled unmotivated by teachers. She also does things that the teachers use as evidence that she lacks motivation. First of all, she doesn't want to be seen entering into an ESL classroom, so she looks around the hallways and she comes late to class all the time. She also doesn't want to be seen holding her ESL textbooks, so she just doesn't bring them. Maria also has very serious personal responsibilities and family responsibilities as the English speaker in her household, she has to accompany her parents often on office visits or to run errands in order to serve as a translator for them. So this is another reason why she would be absent or presenting late to class. All of this information her teachers don't really know until the researcher talks to Maria about this. But based upon their limited interaction and limited view of her identity and what she's doing in the classroom, she's labeled unmotivated. However, Maria, in her social group, lies to her friends who are all African American and says that she's Black and Puerto Rican. The two are not mutually exclusive, but she says this anyhow. And she says that she's African American and she speaks African American English. And she doesn't ring any alarm bells. She manages to fool, very convincingly, her friends, high school students, native speakers of African American English, by knowing and speaking their language exquisitely well. Now, is this an unmotivated English learner? Somebody who's been learning English for about 2 years only and can fool native speakers into believing that she's one of them and she's always spoken this language? No, she's not unmotivated. She's very highly motivated in language learning, but Maria is not invested in what's happening in the English class and the practices of the English classroom, and also she's uninvested in the language that the school believes she needs in comparison to the language that she believes herself that she needs to survive in the social atmosphere. Another English learner that we read about in TESOL research is Aziza, who's chronicled by Ibrahim. And Aziza is a Somali high school student in Canada, another new immigrant, who strives to learn hip-hop slang and African-American English as well, the gestures associated with pop culture, the stance, attitude, all around this kind of hip-hop identity. And she strongly identifies with African-American language and the political resistance that she hears in hip-hop music. She identifies with this because she feels it's very akin to what she's suffering as being powerless and voiceless as a new immigrant, Black African, in this Canadian context. Now, Aziza also has to deal with English class and teachers who talk down to her, and she resents the way that they pity her and her seeming inability to speak proper English. But once again, it's not that she's unmotivated to learn or speak English, it's that she's uninvested in what's happening in the classroom and what the teachers believe that she should be doing and learning. Another learner, English learner, that's documented, whose experiences are documented by Deutsch Dwyer, is Carol. Carol is a Polish immigrant living in the United States. And Carol is a man, and he relates with native speakers who are males and men and women alike. Now, the heterosexual male and female native English speakers, they treat Carol very differently, and they give him differentiated linguistic treatment. So among his heterosexual female friends, Carol has been adopted as almost like a pet. Right? They really like his flamboyant attitude and his performance of masculinity that one would consider kind of queenish in a way, right? And he accepts that identity and he plays to it and he defines himself in that way. Now, his heterosexual female friends adore this about him and love him, and they do a lot of things for him that influence his English learning. They talk to doctors for him, they make phone calls for him, they coddle him in a certain way and treat him almost like this baby and support him in ways that really are not allowing him to push and stretch his skills in the English language, because they feel that they're bonding with him in this way and in the way that he's performing masculinity. Now, the heterosexual male native English speakers, they treat him with a considerable distance, right? They don't really engage him that closely, and their interactions with Carol are very businesslike, A, B, C, D. So the distance and maybe the discomfort that they might feel with the way he performs masculinity, he's not regarded as butch enough to hang out with certain straight guys. This is directly influencing what they do with English with him. They don't cut him the kind of slack that his heterosexual female friends do. They certainly don't coddle him or get too close to him or do things for him. In those situations, he does a lot more with language and pushes and stretches because of the distance in response to the way he performs masculinity. Now, Gordon talks to us about Fa, another English learner who is Lao from the Hmong community and an immigrant to the United States. Now, Fa goes to night classes and she desperately wants to learn English because she has serious family legal problems that she would like to use her English to solve. She has a child, an adult child with legal problems who's involved in the criminal justice system. She would like to hire a lawyer to be able to help with the boy's trouble with the law, and she would also like to hire a lawyer to help with their rental problems. Her family is about to be evicted from their home. Now, when she goes to English class at night, the teacher is practicing the sort of English that Fa does not find useful in the least, right? They're learning things like the apple is red. What is your name? My name is such and such. And her needs are a lot more crucial than that. Additionally, Fa's husband resists the fact that she's attending class, especially at night. She's associating with strangers, men, and she's becoming assertive and independent, and the little bit of English she's managing to learn in this class is enabling her to do things and to accomplish tasks outside and in public in a way that makes him very uncomfortable. Ultimately, Fa remains frustrated with the English instructor and the materials that do not meaningfully address her communicative needs. Once again, we find a learner who is extremely motivated to learn the language, but not invested in what's happening in the classroom. And her gender and her status and her personal relationship with her husband are also influencing her ability to go to class as often as she would like. And her investment in the class, why risk the fighting at home and the stress that she might get for even showing up to class when in class they're talking about the apple being red. Now, we have other learners that King talks to us about, Fo and Hyun. These are gay Korean men living and learning English in New Zealand and Great Britain. Now, both of these men find it easier to talk about their gay identities in English due to greater access to space and to community, and due to the latitude that they believe that the English language gives them to describe their experiences as gay men that the Korean language does not. Right? Now, they also debate coming out in their English class because this is an aspect of their identity that they're not perfectly sure that their English class would be a safe place to comfortably express and discuss. And additionally, they're very frustrated with the power dynamics within the native English speaker gay community and find comfort speaking English with other gay Asian men from different countries. So we see how language and identity are intertwined in their abilities to express themselves, the interactions that they have with members of the target language community, and also with English learners. Now, we may ask, why bring up these controversial issues about racial identity or sexual identity or ethnic identity? What are these controversies doing, for example, in a nice field such as English language learning? Well, when you talk about sexual identities, sexuality is discussed all the time in our English classes. Whose sexuality is the difference? There's always been a heteronormative bent and slant in the work that we do. When we think, for example, when we do vocabulary in our English lessons of families, right? Mom, dad, children, perhaps a dog, right? Whose sexuality, whose families are being discussed and being presented as normal or as dominant, right? So It's not that these questions are not present or identity is not present already in our classrooms. We engage them all the time. When we talk, for example, the exercise, describe your ideal partner. Think about how our English learners who do not necessarily identify with the dominant norms of the certain kind of partner to have or which gender of partner to have, how do they do those exercises and participate in those exercises when they're asked to come up with vocabulary words that would describe their ideal boyfriend or girlfriend? Think about the position that students such as Fio and Young would be put in when they are placed in this space to talk about themselves intimately in their relationships in an English classroom. So, now that we know about our learners and their different identities and how that plays out in their motivations and their investments in the English language learning environment and in English language learning in general, now we ask ourselves, how do identities influence motivations and investments of our English learners in our classroom communities? Now, instead of asking, for example, is this student motivated or not to learn English, take a closer look at their multiplicities and their identities and ask, is this English learner invested in what's happening in my classroom? Thinking about the learners that we looked at previously, we see how learners can be highly motivated, yet have little investment in the classroom practices that a learner may think are useless or irrelevant, hostile, racist, sexist, elitist, homophobic, or alienating. And think about what's going on in our classrooms that could be possibly silencing and alienating the identities of our English learners and directly contributing to their investment or lack thereof in our classrooms. Because, as Norton tells us, despite being highly motivated, a learner could be excluded from the language practices of a classroom and in time positioned as a poor or unmotivated language learner. And we know that's not always the case. Therefore, we should be asking, in addition to motivation, what are our learners' investments in our classrooms? Are they invested in the practices of this particular language learning community? So, now that we've seen who we are, who our learners are, and how our learners' identities can influence motivation and investment in our classrooms, how can we put this into practice? How can we put these understandings of identity and investment into practice in our work in the English language classroom? First of all, we should know our English learners. We should try to administer surveys and questionnaires to find out about their backgrounds, their interests, and their participation in our classrooms. We should try to conduct collaborative, interactive exercises that utilize pair and group discussion to build comfort and to build knowledge about who the members of our classroom community are. And we should also plan meaningful activities with direct links to our learners' lives, their goals, and their real communicative needs. And we should choose and supplement our curricula with materials that are relevant and respectful to our learners' multiple identities. Most importantly, we should promote a safe and supportive classroom community where our learners can have a voice, where they can take risks, and where they feel free to openly assume, explore their many different selves in the English language. In conclusion, we English teachers do not leave our multiple identities outside our classrooms once we walk in. Likewise, our English learners' identities greatly influence their motivations, investments, and ultimately their choices and efforts toward personal transformation through language learning. We can put this understanding of learners' identities, motivations, and investments to use through attention and responsiveness to our learners' needs, their goals, and through providing meaningful and relevant instruction in a safe, supportive classroom community.